Third part. As soon as he awoke, Sheriff Kurtz opened his eyes and realized he was lying on a bed in an examination room in the hospital's internal medicine ward. When he tried to get up, something tugged strongly at his head. And bringing his hand up to it, he felt countless cords there. Some kind of pliable substance covered his scalp, and cords were stuck into it. It must have been the conduction paste they used when taking electroencephalograms. Just as the lawman finished prying the whole mess off his head, the hospital director appeared in the doorway on the far side of the room. The speed with which the old man stepped aside belied his age. The gooey mass the sheriff had hurled slammed against the wall, cords and all. The only thing capable of marring his face any further at this point was retribution. "I'd say our friendship has had it," the sheriff said as he got off the bed. "Would you just wait a minute?" Dr. Allen said, raising one hand. Though the sheriff had been about to uncork some choice vocabulary, the thing that kept his tongue in check was the depth of the pain the old doctor wore on his face. "After having done this to you, it's only fair that I explain all the circumstances. The truth of the matter is, I don't want to tell you, and I believe you'll probably wish you'd never heard it either. You see, I've come to a conclusion. The most unfortunate one." "Where is Sybil?" Sheriff Kurtz asked, as if brushing aside everything the hospital director had just said. He felt around his waist to make sure that his gun was still strapped to his belt. "She's this way. Come with me." "No more sneak attacks," the director said in a sarcastic tone. "What did you do to me?" the sheriff finally inquired after a few minutes of walking in silence. "We checked your brainwaves for abnormalities, though I doubt you'll believe that. Come with me and you'll find all your answers." The two of them got into a wooden elevator and descended into the basement. "Hey, we're in the emergency ward. Is Sybil's condition more serious now?" the sheriff asked, his voice echoing down the cold corridor. Before it had entirely faded, the two of them were greeted by a white door. Tough-looking male nurses stood to either side of it. The sight of one of them carrying an old-fashioned rocket launcher and the other cradling a photon beam rifle made the sheriff's eyes glow with quiet determination. Whatever was going on with Sybil, it was extremely important. "Was Basil okay?" the sheriff asked. "Yep, he's resting now." "Be sure to tell him I'm awful sorry about what I did." One stepped through the doorway, and the sheriff froze in his tracks. The sound of the closing door was quietly embraced by the thin darkness. The bed that held the soundly sleeping girl, and the curtains, and the machine by her pillow, and even the feeble darkness of human design were all very much like her old room. "I just stopped it a little while ago," the hospital director said, having noticed how the sheriff's gaze fell on the machine. "She was connected to your brain, and it was working beautifully. But things got fouled up when we were so very close." "Don't you have any nurses here?" the sheriff asked. "They've finished up. From here on out, no one comes into this room except you and me. And if anyone else tries it, well, I suppose a doctor committing murder does pose a bit of an ethical dilemma." The sheriff eyed the elderly physician with something akin to anxiety. "And what reason would you have for going to that extreme to protect Sybil?" The hospital director gestured to one of the chairs and seated himself in another. After he'd watched the sheriff seat himself into a chair with its back against the wall, Dr. Allen said, "I want to ask you the God's honest truth. Are you sure you really don't know?" Feeling like he might be incinerated by the blazing spark in the other man's eyes, the sheriff replied, "I don't know." "What are you talking about?" The hospital director stared at him. The fierce light in his eyes had a hint of desolation to it that suited the perpetual twilight of the room. Suddenly, the active doctor looked like a tired old man covered with wrinkles and hung with heavy shadows, and Sheriff Crutz had trouble believing his eyes. "Earlier, when I was bringing the hunter back to town, I saw Sybil." As the lawman spoke, he paid special attention to the director's face to see what reaction it would register. But the old physician didn't react at all. Maybe he thought it was a joke. Maybe other matters were occupying his mind. Or just maybe. Tracing back through his memory so he might describe Sybil better, the sheriff suddenly remembered something. Something he'd seen somewhere before. Her clothes, the white blouse and the skirt. "The Sybil you saw was one I called forth." The impact of the director's words jarred the sheriff back to his senses. The wind whistled in his ear. "What did you just say?" "To be a bit more precise, I extracted Sybil's image from her dream, using this device here." "Then, does that mean you can use that thing to wake her up?" The director said nothing. "I guess that's what I should expect from a machine from the Capitol." "That's fantastic." "No," Dr. Allen said as he looked down at the peacefully slumbering girl with a pained gaze. "This machine can't awaken Sybil. The only thing that could do that is the noble who left his fang marks on her throat. And another thing, this isn't from the Capitol." "It's not. Well, who made it then?" Sheriff Crutz asked, suspiciously eyeing the complex arrangement of metal, crystals, and batteries. "I did, and it took me just 2 hours." The sheriff was at a loss for words. 2 hours before I ran into you and the hunter outside her room. I had just gone back to my office after finishing my rounds. I thought I'd stare at the window for a while, have myself a smoke, straighten up my desk. When I found this there, the sheriff was still speechless. "Well, not really this, but all its parts. They didn't even have plans with them, but I took one look at them and knew how to put it together. Now, don't you look at me that way," he said to the sheriff. "I'm not crazy. You should know better than anyone I'm not that kind of person. I always tell the truth." "That's true, but..." "Come on, Crutz," the hospital director said in a nostalgic tone. Very rarely did he call the sheriff by name, but what they were involved in now had made them compatriots, or, perhaps more accurately, co-conspirators. It's been a long 30 years. When this happened to Sybil, I was just 35, the doctor still wet behind the ears. I tried so hard to save her, like I was fighting for my very life. A ghastly spark resided in the director's eyes. It was as if something extremely precious had been taken from his soul, and that spark was a light shining out of the abyss left in its place. I can still recall how it was back then. You and Sybil walking home from school, holding hands, and Sybil making you garlands with flowers from the field out back, white and blue ones. Maybe they were Selene blossoms. She put them around your neck, but you got all bashful and took them off like a big dope. On the other hand, at that time Sybil fell into the river, you jumped in without a second thought, even though the current was wild enough to drag a man away in only knee-deep water. And once she went out grape picking with her friends and she was the only one who didn't come back. You were the one who went off with a beat-up old rifle in hand to search for her all over a demon-filled forest. Isn't that right? Sheriff Crooks nodded. His expression looked like he was staring at something right in front of him. But on the other side of an eternal gulf. Were Sybil's hands warm? Were her lips soft the first time you kissed them? Was that golden hair of hers as soft as silk? Well, was it? Dr. Allen asked. And when she pressed her feverish cheek against your chest, didn't she tell you it was like iron? And that she could hear the beating of your heart? Probably. The tone of the old man's voice suddenly dropped. What if all that was a lie? He said. For a brief while, the sheriff's expression showed he was still lost in remembrance. And then, slowly studying the face of the elderly physician, he said, What? I'll tell you. Gently resting his hand on Sybil's forehead, the director muttered in a low voice, I'll tell you something you're better off not hearing. Something you're better off not knowing. Page break indicated by a small cross. When Sheriff Crooks got back to the station, Dee was lying down in the cell without bars. What happened here? The sheriff asked, and Bates explained the situation. As soon as Clemens gets out of the hospital, lock him up, the lawman ordered. We're gonna make an example of him. Give him 2 weeks. Now, get out there and patrol. I'm gonna ask our guests some questions. Yes, sir. Wearing an expression that showed he didn't completely understand, Bates stepped out of the office. The sheriff turned around to face Dee. There was an incredulous look in his eyes as he inspected the shattered wall. Did you solve the mystery about Sybil? Dee asked softly. Nope. Think you know the answer. How long are you going to keep me in here? Until this is over. When will it be over? I don't know. The sheriff replied warily. Of course, Dee had no way of knowing the lawman wore the same tired air as the hospital director. From what Bates tells me, you were sleeping. You dream about Sybil? There was some interference. The hunter replied, Interference. It seems there are those who don't want me to respond to the girl's call. Are you saying a foe can get inside dreams? The sheriff muttered as if in a daze. In that case, would you even call it a dream? What do you think? Maybe even dreams can dream. Dee quietly gazed at the sheriff. I don't mind staying in here. But are you sure that's the best thing for the rest of you? Just what's that supposed to mean? Sheriff Crooks was gazing back at Dee. For the first time, a mood of impending violence hung between them. Their eyes shifted in the same direction simultaneously. A plump female form burst energetically into the cell while her feverish knocking still echoed from the door. The face, now pale, was that of the jack-of-all-trades, Maggie. "Sheriff, we've got serious trouble," she bellowed, her tone perfectly matching the energy that carried her into the room. "What is it?" the sheriff asked. The woman pointed out the door. "Well, I hadn't been out there in a dog's age, to old Mrs. Shelton's, I mean." Dee's eyes sparkled with sudden interest. "But when I got there, you just wouldn't... When I got there, I found the old woman out back in her garden, with a black arrow through her throat." Chapter 4. End.